Sunday afternoon, and the whole block could smell what was happening inside that kitchen. Onions in hot grease, cornbread already cooling on the counter, and something sweet in the oven that nobody was allowed to touch until after the plates were cleared. Big Mama did not follow recipes. She followed memory, and the dishes she kept alive in those grease-stained spiral notebooks are vanishing faster than anyone wants to admit. Number 19 turned a tin of fish that most modern kitchens would throw away into the best Friday supper on the block. And number 7 used every last piece of the hog that polite kitchens pretended did not exist. The food industry moved on, but these recipes stayed right where Big Mama left them. Hit subscribe because this is the history no other food channel is telling. Here are 30 forgotten dishes you could only find in Big Mama's old cookbooks. Number 30, tomato pudding. The name alone stops people. A pudding made from tomatoes sounds like a mistake, but this was a real dish that showed up in church cookbooks across the Deep South from the 1930s onward. Canned tomatoes, brown sugar, and torn bread went into a baking dish and came out as something between a casserole and a cobbler. The sweetness of the tomato met the sugar and turned into something close to a fruit dessert. Big Mama served it alongside the main meal, not after it. Most people under 50 have never heard of it. The recipe was never complicated enough to earn a place in a fancy cookbook, and that is exactly why it disappeared. It belonged to kitchens that measured success by whether everyone left the table full. Number 29, ash cake. Cornmeal mixed with water and salt, shaped into a flat round, wrapped in damp cabbage leaves and buried in the hot ashes of the fireplace. The leaves kept the ash from sticking while the heat baked the bread through. Big Mama pulled it out with tongs, peeled the charred leaves away, and broke the cake open at the table while it was still steaming. Ash cake was the oldest form of bread in the Black South, older than ovens, older than skillets. When cast iron stoves replaced open hearths, the ash cake lost its only cooking method, and the bread that had fed families for generations became something only the oldest living relatives still talked about. Number 28, leather breeches beans. Green beans strung whole on heavy thread with a darning needle and hung from porch rafters to dry in the late summer air. Big Mama left them hanging for weeks until the pods shriveled and turned brown and light as paper. When winter came, she pulled down a string, snapped the dried beans into pieces, and simmered them for hours with salt pork until they rehydrated into something tender and deeply flavored. Leather breeches had a concentrated, smoky taste that fresh green beans could never match. The drying changed the sugars and gave the cooked beans an almost meaty depth. Nobody hangs beans from the ceiling anymore, and the taste that came from slow air drying has no substitute. Number 27, poke salad. Every spring, pokeweed pushed up through the fence line and along the edge of the garden. Big Mama knew the leaves were poisonous raw, so she boiled them 3 times, changing the water each round until the bitterness and the toxin cooked out completely. The drained greens were fried in bacon drippings with diced onion and scrambled egg stirred through at the end. Poke salad was survival food that required knowledge passed down face to face. Pick the wrong leaves, the mature ones with the dark purple berries, and the plant could make a person dangerously sick. Only the young spring shoots were safe, and only after that triple boil. The generation that understood which leaves to pick is thinning out, and the weed is reclaiming the fence lines unbothered. Number 26, cornmeal mush. Cornmeal stirred slowly into boiling salted water until it thickened into a smooth, heavy porridge. Big Mama served it hot with butter and sorghum syrup for breakfast, spooned into bowls, and eaten fast before it cooled and stiffened. Whatever mush was left in the pot got poured into a loaf pan and left on the counter to set solid. The next morning, she sliced the cold mush into thick slabs and fried them in bacon grease until both sides turned golden and crisp. Fried mush was breakfast again, but completely different from the porridges started as. The crisp shell gave way to a soft, creamy center, and the bacon fat added a salt that the original porridge never carried. Cornmeal mush cost almost nothing, required no oven, and fed a household twice from the same pot. Number 25, crackling gravy. The cracklings left over from rendering lard were crumbled into a flour and drippings roux and thinned with milk or water until a thick pork-flavored gravy formed. Big Mama poured it over hot biscuits on mornings when there was no bacon, no sausage, and no money for either. The cracklings gave the gravy a salt and a rough texture that plain sawmill gravy could never match. Every spoonful carried a crunch that surprised anyone tasting it for the first time. Crackling gravy disappeared from the breakfast table when families stopped rendering their own lard and started buying it in a cardboard tub from the grocery store. Without the cracklings, the gravy lost the only thing that set it apart from plain flour paste thinned with water. Number 24, fried salt pork with cream gravy. Thick slices of salt pork soaked in water overnight to pull the brine, then dredged in flour and fried until the fat rendered and the outside turned brown and crisp. Big Mama stirred flour into the drippings and poured in milk to build a cream gravy right there in the same pan. Salt pork and gravy over biscuits was a full breakfast that required no fresh meat and no refrigeration. The pork kept for months in the pantry, salt cured and ready whenever the icebox was empty. When fresh bacon became cheap and available year-round, salt pork lost its place on the breakfast table, and nobody missed it until the taste of the gravy came back to them years later. Number 23, Jerusalem artichoke relish. The tubers grew wild, knobby, and dirt-covered, dug up from the edge of the garden where they spread without asking permission. Big Mama scrubbed them clean, chopped them with cabbage, onion, and bell pepper, and pickled the whole batch in a mustard and vinegar brine, seasoned with celery seed and turmeric. The finished relish was crunchy, sharp, and sweet enough to cut through heavy winter food. Jerusalem artichoke relish sat alongside other preserves on the pantry shelf, but it had a raw, earthy crunch that nothing else in the kitchen could match. The tubers are still out there, growing along every untended fence row across the South. What used to be a pantry staple has become a weed that nobody recognizes as food. Number 22, egg custard pie. Eggs, sugar, milk, vanilla, and a pinch of nutmeg beaten together and poured into a raw pie shell, then baked low and slow until the custard set but still trembled in the center when the pan was tapped. Big Mama pulled it from the oven when the top turned pale gold and the filling finished setting as it cooled on the counter. Egg custard pie was the simplest dessert in the cookbook and one of the hardest to get right. Bake it a minute too long and the custard turns grainy. Pull it too soon and the center never set. The women who made it well knew their ovens by years of listening and adjusting. When instant pudding moved into the kitchen, the patience that egg custard required became harder to justify than the ingredients it needed. Number 21, neck bone and rice. Pork neck bones were what the butcher had left after every better cut had been claimed. Big Mama bought them by the pound, browned them in a heavy pot, and braised them with onion and garlic until the meat surrendered to the heat and slid clean off the joints. The gravy that built up at the bottom of the pot was the real prize. Spooned over white rice, it turned a bowl of plain grain into something worth sitting down for. The bones themselves carried almost no meat, but what clung to them had been flavored by hours of slow cooking into something richer and more deeply seasoned than any pork chop could ever claim to be. Neck bones cost more per pound today than some cuts that used to outrank them. Number 20, pickled beets. Big Mama pulled beets from the garden in late summer, boiled them whole until the skin slipped off, sliced them into glass jars, and poured hot vinegar brine over the top. The jars went to the pantry shelf and stayed there all winter long. Pickled beets showed up at cold suppers and Saturday sandwiches. The brine was spiced with whole cloves and a cinnamon stick, and some families saved the liquid to pickle hard-boiled eggs once the beets were gone, turning the whites a deep magenta. The whole process required nothing more than vinegar, sugar, salt, and patience. Pickled beets were one of the simplest preserves Big Mama put up, and one of the first to vanish when home canning stopped being part of daily life. Number 19, sardine patties. Open a tin of sardines in any modern kitchen, and most people recoil. But Big Mama opened that tin the way other cooks reached for ground beef. She drained the fish, mashed them with a fork, mixed in egg, cornmeal, diced onion, and a heavy pour of black pepper, shaped them into flat rounds, and fried them in hot oil until the outside turned crisp and golden. Sardine patties were a Friday staple in black households where meat was saved for Sunday dinner. The canned sardines were cheap, available at every corner store and country market, and they kept without refrigeration. In a house with no reliable icebox, that mattered more than flavor. But the flavor was there, and it was better than anyone outside that kitchen would ever know. The cornmeal crust gave each patty a crunch that masked the fishiness, and the onion and pepper carried the taste. Children who swore they hated sardines ate these without knowing what was inside. Big Mama never told them. She just set the plate down and let the hot sauce do the rest. Sardine patties appeared in church recipe collections from Alabama to the south side of Chicago. Nobody photographed them. Nobody wrote a feature about them. The dish existed because it solved a problem. Protein on a tight budget, ready in 15 minutes, using ingredients that never spoiled. When fresh fish became easier to find and home freezers became standard in black kitchens, the sardine patty lost its reason to exist. The tin stayed on the shelf. The recipe stayed in the cookbook. Nobody reached for either one. A dish that had fed Friday tables across the Black South for generations quietly disappeared, replaced by nothing at all. Number 18, ground nut soup. Roasted peanuts ground into a paste and stirred into a pot of simmering chicken broth with tomatoes, onion, and a heavy shake of cayenne pepper. The soup thickened as the peanut butter dissolved, turning the broth rich and nutty with a heat that built slowly in the back of the throat. Groundnut soup traces a direct line back to West Africa, where variations of it had been made for centuries before enslaved people carried the recipe across the Atlantic along with the peanut itself. Big Mama's version used whatever was at hand, sometimes with a piece of smoked meat for depth, sometimes without. The dish sat at the intersection of African cooking tradition and Southern pantry necessity, and it deserved a place at every table that claimed to honor where soul food truly came from. Number 17, chitterling loaf. Big Mama cleaned the chitterlings the slow way, scrubbing every inch under cold water until they were spotless. She simmered them for hours until they turned tender, then chopped them fine and packed them into a loaf pan with seasoned cornmeal mush. The whole thing set overnight in the icebox and came out firm enough to slice. Fried the next morning in a hot skillet, each slice of chitterling loaf crisped on the outside while the inside stayed soft and savory. The dish took the most polarizing ingredient in the soul food kitchen and turned it into something neat, portable, and served on a plate instead of in a pot. Chitterling loaf vanished when younger generations decided the smell of the long simmer was reason enough to leave the tradition behind. Number 16, chow chow. Green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, and bell peppers chopped fine and cooked in a sweet vinegar brine with mustard seed, celery seed, and turmeric until everything softened but kept enough bite to crunch between the teeth. Big Mama put up jars of chow chow at the end of every growing season, using whatever the garden still had before the first frost killed it. Chow chow went on everything. It topped pinto beans, dressed a plate of greens, and brightened up cold ham sandwiches in January when nothing fresh was growing. Each jar carried the flavor of September into the dead of winter. When home gardens shrank and the canning supplies gathered dust, the last jars of chow chow were opened with nothing behind them to take their place. Most of these recipes were never measured. Big Mama cooked by feel, by smell, by the sound the oil made when the batter hit the pan. That was not a quirk. That was a system passed from mother to daughter in kitchens where no cookbook lay open. When those women died, the recipes often died with them. The spiral-bound church cookbooks tried to capture what they knew, but instructions like a handful of flour and cook until it looks right do not translate to a printed page. What got lost was not just the food, it was the instinct that came from making the same dish hundreds of times without writing a word down. Number 15, preserved melon rind. After the red flesh was gone, Big Mama peeled the green outer skin and cut the white rind into neat cubes. She soaked them overnight in salted water, drained them the next morning, and simmered them in a syrup of vinegar, sugar, cinnamon sticks, and whole cloves until the pieces turned to translucent and tender. The finished preserves were sweet, tangy, and just firm enough to snap cleanly between the teeth. They sat in jars on the pantry shelf alongside the beets and the pear preserves, proof that nothing that passed through Big Mama's kitchen ever made it to the waste pile if it could be sealed in a jar instead. The rind that other families threw away became, in her hands, something worth fighting over at the supper table. Number 14, rice callus. In the oldest black communities along the Gulf Coast, leftover rice was mixed with flour, eggs, sugar, and a little yeast and left to rise overnight. The next morning, Big Mama spooned the batter into hot oil and fried it into golden puffy fritters, dusted with powdered sugar while they were still warm enough to melt it. Rice callus was sold on the streets of New Orleans by black women balancing covered baskets on their heads, calling out to the morning crowds. The dish traces directly to West African rice fritter traditions carried across the Atlantic by enslaved people who brought their cooking knowledge with them even when they were allowed to bring nothing else. For generations, callus were one of the few ways an enslaved or formerly enslaved woman could earn her own money. The fritters funded freedom papers, church tithes, and the first savings that built free black households in Louisiana. Rice callus vanished from the streets by the early 20th century as the women who carried the baskets grew old and the city changed around them. The recipe retreated into private kitchens and then into handwritten notebooks that gathered dust on shelves nobody opened. A few restaurants in New Orleans have brought callus back in recent years, serving them on white plates with powdered sugar sifted neatly on top. But the street version, hot and sugared, wrapped in newspaper and eaten standing on a corner while the morning fog burned off the river, belonged to a different city entirely. That version was made by women who woke before dawn and carried their livelihood on their heads through streets that have since been paved over and renamed. The recipe survived, but the world it came from did not. Number 13, lima bean soup, dried lima beans, soaked overnight, then simmered the next day with a ham bone, onion, celery, and enough water to cover everything by a few inches. The soup cooked until the beans broke down and the broth turned thick on its own. No flour, no thickener. The starch from the beans did all the work. Big Mama served it over rice or with cornbread on the side. Lima bean soup cost almost nothing to make and fed the entire household for 2 days running. The dish faded not because anyone lost the recipe, but because dried beans require a kind of time that most modern kitchens no longer give. A pot of lima beans asked for a morning, and most mornings now belong to something else. Number 12, tomato sandwich. Soft bread, a thick spread of mayonnaise, and a tomato slice cut wide enough to hang over the edges. Salt and black pepper on top, nothing else. Big Mama made tomato sandwiches in August when the garden was producing more tomatoes than any family could eat, and she made them standing at the counter because they did not require sitting down. The juice ran through the bread and down your wrist, and nobody cared. Tomato sandwiches were not in the cookbooks because there was nothing to write down. Everyone in the Black South understood what a tomato sandwich was, and everyone had a strong opinion about the bread and the brand of mayonnaise. The dish required a garden tomato, ripe and warm from the vine. A store-bought tomato in January cannot carry it. Number 11, smothered okra with tomatoes. Fresh okra sliced into rounds and cooked low in a covered pot with canned tomatoes, onion, and a bay leaf until everything melted together and the okra released its natural body into the broth. The dish landed somewhere between a side and a stew, ladled over rice or scooped up with cornbread torn by hand. Big Mama knew that cutting the pods small before they hit the heat was the whole secret. The thickness that made children push their plates away was the same thing that held the pot together and gave every spoonful weight. The version made with garden okra picked that morning had a green, almost grassy sweetness that frozen bags shipped from a warehouse cannot touch. Number 10, syllabub, sweetened cream whipped with a splash of wine or lemon juice until it foamed and thickened into a light, airy dessert served in a cup or a glass. Syllabub reaches back centuries, passed down from colonial plantation kitchens where enslaved cooks prepared it for the main house and adapted it for their own tables. Big Mama's version used whatever acid was at hand, usually vinegar or buttermilk when wine was not available. The texture landed somewhere between whipped cream and a soft custard, dissolving on the tongue almost before it could be tasted. Syllabub was a celebration dessert brought out at weddings and holiday dinners when something lighter and fancier than pudding was called for. The name alone sounds old enough to keep modern cooks from attempting it, and so they do not. Number 9, sweet potato biscuits. Mashed sweet potato folded into biscuit dough gave the biscuits a golden color, a faintly sweet flavor, and a softness that plain flour biscuits could not match. Big Mama made them when the sweet potatoes were coming in during the fall, and they went to the table with butter, sorghum, syrup, or alongside a plate of greens and potlikker. The sweet potato stretched the flour, which meant more biscuits from the same sack of wheat. In a kitchen where flour was rationed carefully, that math mattered as much as the taste. Sweet potato biscuits showed up in some of the oldest African American recipe collections on record. Simple enough that anyone alive today could bake them with nothing more than a bowl and an oven, but almost nobody does. The sweet potato waits in the pantry untouched. Here is something worth saying plainly. The reason so many of these dishes disappeared is not because they stopped tasting good. It is because the women who made them were never given credit for what they built. Big Mama's Cookbook was not published by a New York press. It was a spiral-bound collection passed around at church, photocopied until the pages blurred, held together with a rubber band in a kitchen drawer. The recipes inside fed families through the Depression, through wartime rationing, through decades when the ingredients cost almost nothing because nobody else wanted them. When the food industry decided those ingredients were trendy, the prices climbed, and the families who had been cooking with them for generations could no longer afford what they had always made. Number 8, muscadine jelly. Wild muscadine grapes grew along fences and tree lines across the rural South, thick-skinned and musky, nothing like the table grapes sold in stores. Big Mama gathered them in late summer, crushed them by hand, strained the juice through cheesecloth, and cooked it down with sugar until it hit a rolling boil and sheeted off a spoon. The jelly set firm and dark, tasting like something between a Concord grape and a plum with a floral sweetness that no commercial brand has ever managed to replicate. Muscadine jelly spread on a hot biscuit was September in a jar. The vines are still growing wild across the South, but the women who knew exactly which ones ripened sweetest and which week of the year to pick them are harder to find with every passing season. Number 7, scrapple. After the hog was slaughtered and every recognizable cut was accounted for, the head, feet, and organ meats went into a pot and simmered until the meat fell apart and the broth turned rich. Big Mama strained the liquid, pulled every scrap of meat from the bones, chopped it fine, and stirred it back into the pot with cornmeal and a generous pour of sage and black pepper. The mixture cooked on the stove, stirred constantly until it was thick enough to mound on a spoon. Then it was poured into loaf pans and left in the icebox overnight to set. The next morning, she sliced the cold loaf and fried each piece in a hot skillet until the outside turned dark and crisp, while the inside stayed soft and dense, almost creamy. Scrapple was a breakfast staple in Black communities from the Chesapeake region down through the Carolinas, wherever hog killing season meant using every last part of the animal because letting anything go to waste was not just careless, but sinful. The dish had cousins under different names in other communities, but Big Mama's version, heavy on the sage, fried in lard until the edges crackled, was its own tradition entirely. Scrapple required a whole day of cooking, a second day of setting, and a willingness to eat parts of the hog that most people alive today have never seen outside of a butcher shop. When the slaughter moved behind factory walls and pork started arriving in clean, shrink-wrapped cuts at the supermarket, the raw material for scrapple vanished from the home kitchen. The loaf pan went back in the cabinet, and the recipe stayed in the cookbook, waiting for hands that knew what to do with a whole hog. Number 6, fried hand pies. Pie dough rolled thin and cut into circles the size of a saucer, filled with stewed apples or peach preserves or sweet potato, then folded in half, sealed with a fork, and fried in hot oil until the crust blistered and turned a deep golden brown. Big Mama made fried pies on Saturday mornings when the children were underfoot and needed something to keep them quiet. The crust shattered at the first bite, and the filling inside was hot enough to burn the roof of a careless mouth. Fried hand pies showed up at church homecomings and family reunions, carried in baskets lined with wax paper, no plate or fork required. When convenience stores filled the gap with packaged turnovers, the homemade version lost the audience that once lined up for it at every gathering. Number 5, cake crumb pudding. Stale cake crumbled by hand into a baking dish, soaked with sweetened milk and beaten eggs, then baked until the top turned golden and the center set into a soft custard. Big Mama used whatever cake had gone dry. Pound cake, yellow cake, the last wedge of coconut cake nobody finished Sunday. The result was richer than bread pudding because the cake had already been sweetened and flavored before it ever went stale. Cake crumb pudding was the final stop before the trash can, proof that even a dessert that had already been served and forgotten still had one more life left in it. The dish never appeared in published cookbooks because it was never planned. It was invented each time from whatever crumbs were at hand. Number 4, blackberry dumplings. Wild blackberries, picked from the brambles along the field edges, cooked down with sugar and water into a thick, bubbling sauce, then spoonfuls of biscuit dough dropped directly into the simmering fruit. Big Mama covered the pot and let the dumplings steam until they swelled and cooked through, soaking up the berry juice from the bottom while the top stayed pillowy and pale. The dish was served hot in bowls, the dumplings stained purple underneath and floating in a sauce that was equal parts fruit and syrup. Blackberry dumplings required nothing more than a bucket, a walk to the fence row, and the willingness to come home with scratched arms and stained fingers. When the brambles were cleared for development and the berries moved into plastic clamshells at the grocery store, the dumplings lost the ingredient that made them free. Number 3, damson plum preserves. The small, dark plums grew on trees planted by grandparents and great-grandparents, sour enough to pucker the mouth when eaten raw, but perfect for preserving. Big Mama halved them, pulled the pits, and cooked them down with sugar until the fruit broke apart and the syrup turned a deep, almost purple black. Damson plum preserves had a tartness that no grape or blackberry jam could match, and the flavor was complex enough to stand up to a salty biscuit without being overwhelmed. The trees that produced the fruit were old and slow growing, and when they died, most families did not replant. The preserves lasted as long as the jars on the shelf held out, and when the last jar was opened and scraped clean, the recipe went with it. Number 2, cane syrup cake. Cane syrup poured heavy into a batter of flour, eggs, butter, and warm spices, then baked into a dense, dark cake that smelled like the sugar mill itself. Big Mama baked cane syrup cake when white sugar was too dear and molasses was too bitter for company. The syrup gave the cake a rounded sweetness with a caramel depth that granulated sugar could never reach. Every slice was moist enough to eat without frosting, and it kept for days wrapped in a cloth on the counter. Cane syrup cake belonged to families who lived close enough to a sugar mill to buy the syrup by the gallon. When the small mills closed, the syrup became a specialty item, and the cake that had once been the cheapest dessert in the kitchen became something only people with long memories still baked. Number 1, Sunday rice and gravy. This was the foundation. After the chicken was fried or the roast came out of the oven, Big Mama poured a little water or broth into the hot pan, scraped up every brown bit stuck to the bottom with a wooden spoon, stirred in flour, and cooked it all together until a thick, dark gravy formed. That gravy went over a mound of white rice, and that plate was the center of Sunday dinner. Rice and gravy was not a side dish. It held everything else together. The greens sat next to it. The cornbread sopped it up. The children asked for seconds of it before touching anything else on their plate. Big Mama made it without thinking because her mother did the same. 30 dishes, and this one never needed a cookbook.
Peach and cornbread pudding was a layered dessert that brought together juicy fresh peaches and moist, crumbly cornbread soaked in a sweet custard. This dish capitalized on the abundance of peaches during harvest season and the staple nature of cornbread in southern kitchens. Home cooks layered slices of cornbread with peeled, sliced peaches before pouring a creamy mixture of eggs, milk, and sugar over the top. The pudding was then baked until golden and set, producing a warm, comforting dessert that balanced fruity sweetness with a buttery texture. This recipe represented a resourceful use of pantry staples and seasonal fruits, turning simple ingredients into a memorable treat. It was often served at family dinners and church socials, embodying both hospitality and tradition. The combination of fruit and cornbread made it a unique contribution to African American culinary heritage, showcasing creativity in desserts. Today, it remains a nostalgic favorite that connects modern palates to classic Southern flavors. This was not your average stew. Son of a Gun stew was a chuckwagon classic, made from every edible part of a calf: heart, liver, marrow, tongue, and sometimes even the brain if it had not gone to the dogs first. Cowboys did not waste a single bite, and the trail cook was expected to know how to turn those scraps into something halfway decent. The stew simmered in cast iron over open flame, thickened with flour or old coffee grounds, and flavored with salt if you were lucky enough to have it. A pot of Son of a Gun was more than food. It was a reminder that survival meant using everything you had, no matter how it looked or smelled going in. It filled you up, kept your strength, and tasted better than it had any right to after riding a horse all day. The name? That came from the fact that nobody ever wanted to admit what was actually in it. This was food for hard men under hard skies, and it stuck to your bones like nothing else.
Number 21, sweet potato pone. This was not sweet potato pie and not sweet potato casserole. Sweet potato pone was older than both. The recipe appeared in handwritten church cookbooks from the 1880s across Georgia, Alabama, and the Mississippi Delta. Raw sweet potatoes were grated by hand on a box grater, mixed with molasses, butter, eggs, and spices, then baked slow until the top cracked and the center set dense and dark, almost like a pudding. It took close to 2 hours in a wood-fired oven. The texture was heavy, somewhere between cornbread and fudge, and it was eaten warm with nothing on top. Grating enough sweet potato for a family of 8 meant raw knuckles and sore arms. When canned sweet potatoes and pre-made pie crusts showed up in stores in the 1950s, sweet potato pone was one of the first recipes to drop out of the rotation. Nobody noticed until the hands that grated them were gone.
Turkey neck soup was a nourishing broth-based soup made using flavorful turkey necks simmered with root vegetables and herbs to create a rich, hearty meal. This soup made use of often overlooked parts of the turkey, reflecting a tradition of resourcefulness and respect for the whole animal. The necks were slowly cooked until tender, releasing deep flavors into the broth that was both warming and sustaining. Root vegetables like carrots, onions, and potatoes added body and nutrition, making the soup a filling choice especially in colder months. Popular in African American households, this recipe symbolized thriftiness and culinary skill, turning inexpensive cuts into delicious meals. The soup was commonly served with cornbread or rice and was a staple at family tables during gatherings and everyday dinners alike. Its enduring popularity speaks to a legacy of making the most of what was available while creating comforting, flavorful food. This was no frozen grocery store pie. Venison pot pie came from hunters and homesteaders, made with fresh shot deer meat that had been stewed for hours over low heat. It was mixed with carrots, potatoes, or wild onions if you had them, and poured into a rough pie crust made from flour and lard. The crust was thick, never flaky, and it needed to be. It had to hold up against days-old stew and keep well without a refrigerator. The pie would bake in a heavy Dutch oven, often buried in coals, while the smell filled the entire cabin. It was a special dinner, usually reserved for after a good hunt or around holidays when families gathered. You could slice it like cake and serve it warm or cold. It tasted like salt, smoke, and hard-earned luck. If you had enough venison to make 2, you stored 1 under a towel for the next day. No one ever said no to a second helping.
Back to the list. Number 23, poke salad. The plant grew wild along fence rows and ditches across the South, and in spring, when the pantry was at its emptiest, women went out with a bucket and picked the young leaves before they turned toxic. Poke salad had to be boiled 3 separate times. The water poured off between each boil because the mature plant is poisonous. The old cookbooks were specific about this. 3 waters, no shortcuts. After the 3rd boil, the greens were fried in bacon grease with scrambled eggs. It was bitter, earthy, and free. The dish showed up in community cookbooks from East Tennessee to the Alabama Black Belt, always with the same warning about the 3 boils. Skip one and you would know it. Wild food foraging is trendy now, but for Black families in the rural South, it was Tuesday. Nobody called it foraging, they called it getting by.
Molasses glazed ham combined the sweet, robust flavor of molasses with savory ham to create an economical yet indulgent dish common in mid-century Southern kitchens. This recipe made use of affordable ham cuts, often shoulder or picnic hams, which were slow-cooked and then brushed generously with a sticky molasses glaze. The glaze caramelized in the oven, infusing the meat with rich sweetness, balanced by a hint of saltiness. Molasses was a staple sweetener in African American households, valued for its deep flavor and affordability compared to refined sugar. The dish was a centerpiece at family gatherings and holiday meals, symbolizing both celebration and resourcefulness. Cooking ham with molasses allowed cooks to stretch ingredients while still producing a dish that felt special and satisfying. Though less common today, this recipe reflects a culinary heritage of making the most out of pantry staples while honoring flavor. Its lingering aroma and rich taste evoke memories of home kitchens filled with warmth and tradition. You might wrinkle your nose, but fried rattlesnake was a real meal on the frontier. If you were living off the land, you ate what the land gave you, and sometimes that meant a coiled-up surprise near your boots. Rattlesnake meat was surprisingly tender and mild, almost like chicken, and once you peeled the skin and cleaned the bones, it fried up fast. Cornmeal crust gave it crunch, and a sprinkle of pepper or dried herbs gave it flavor. Folks who lived near the desert or in rocky canyons got used to seeing these snakes. Some made it a sport to hunt them, others just got desperate enough to try. Either way, you dipped the meat in egg, rolled it in cornmeal, and dropped it in hot fat. It sizzled, popped, and came out golden. Eaten with dandelion greens or roasted roots, it was more than just edible. It was a story. One you told around a fire long after the danger was gone.
Number 19, hoe cake. The name was literal. Before the American Revolution, enslaved field workers cooked cornmeal batter on the flat blade of a garden hoe held over an open fire. There was no kitchen, no oven, no table. There was a tool meant for digging, repurposed for cooking, because it was the only flat piece of metal within reach. The earliest written references appear in Virginia plantation records from the 1700s, where overseers noted that enslaved people baked cakes on their hoes during midday breaks. By the early 1800s, hoe cake had migrated indoors. Cast iron griddles replaced the hoe blade, and the recipe appeared in nearly every Southern cookbook published before the Civil War. But the name stuck. Hoe cake, a word that carries inside it the full history of Black cooking in America, making something nourishing out of almost nothing, using tools that were never designed for the purpose. The batter itself was the simplest thing imaginable. Cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, cooked flat until the edges brown. Some versions added a spoonful of lard. Some added buttermilk, but the original needed nothing more than meal, water, and heat. Abraham Lincoln reportedly ate hoe cakes as a child in Kentucky. Frederick Douglass wrote about them. The dish crossed every line of class and color in the antebellum South. And then it vanished. Not because it stopped tasting good, but because the name reminded people of something the country wanted to forget. The garden hoe hanging in the shed became just a garden tool again. The cake baked on it became just cornbread. and the people who invented it became a footnote in someone else's cookbook.
Brown sugar-baked beans were a hearty side dish, featuring slow-cooked beans sweetened with brown sugar and seasoned with spices to create a rich, comforting flavor. This recipe was a common accompaniment at family gatherings, barbecues, and everyday meals, highlighting beans as a nutritious and affordable protein source. The beans were simmered gently with molasses or brown sugar, onions, and sometimes bacon or ham hocks for added depth. The sweetness balanced the earthiness of the beans, making the dish both filling and flavorful. Rooted in Southern cooking traditions, brown sugar-baked beans reflected the importance of beans in African American diets and the ingenuity in seasoning them with pantry staples. Cooking the beans low and slow allowed flavors to meld, producing a dish that could feed large families economically. This recipe also symbolized communal meals and celebrations, where food brought people together around the table. It remains a beloved comfort food with strong ties to cultural identity. Rabbit was one of the few meats you did not have to buy. You trapped it, you skinned it, you cooked it over a low flame and gave thanks for every bite. Stewed rabbit with wild onions was a meal of real effort. Catching the meat was half the battle, but cleaning it was even harder. Once in the pot, the meat softened slowly, and the onions, dug from fields or creek beds, gave it a sweet, peppery edge. Sometimes folks added vinegar or dried apples just to stretch the flavor. You could serve it over biscuits or eat it straight from the pot. This was food for people who made do with what they had and did not ask for more. It was quiet, filling, and honest. A dish that reminded you that hunger does not care about preferences. You ate to keep going. You ate because something had to.
Number 22, leather breeches. Every fall across Appalachia and the Upper South, green beans were threaded onto long strings with a needle and hung from porch rafters or kitchen ceiling beams to dry in the air. They hung there for weeks, shriveling into tough, leathery strips that looked like nothing you would want to eat. The cookbooks called them leather breeches. When winter came, the dried beans were pulled down, soaked overnight, and simmered low with a ham hock or a piece of smoked side meat. After hours in the pot, they softened into something rich and deep with a concentrated flavor that fresh green beans could never match. The method came through the Caribbean and into the American South. Dehydration was preservation before refrigeration existed. The strings came down for good when chest freezers arrived.
Okra fritters were a beloved snack or side dish featuring chopped okra mixed into a seasoned batter and fried to golden crispiness. These fritters combined the natural sliminess of okra with crunchy breading to create a texture that was both unique and comforting. Popular in African American cooking, okra was a widely cultivated vegetable with deep roots tracing back to African cuisine. The fritters were often served alongside main dishes or enjoyed as a casual treat, showcasing the versatility of okra beyond stews and soups. The batter typically included cornmeal or flour, herbs, and spices to enhance the flavor and add a satisfying bite. Okra fritters were a practical and tasty way to celebrate local produce while creating a dish that appealed to all ages. Their crispy exterior and tender interior made them a crowd favorite at family dinners and community gatherings. This recipe exemplifies how traditional ingredients were elevated through simple, skillful preparation. Prairie chicken was not chicken at all. It was wild grouse or quail, lean and gamey, and harder to catch than it was to cook. These birds were everywhere across the plains in the early days, and they fed whole families with just one shot and a lucky morning. The dressing, what we would now call stuffing, was made with old bread, sage, and whatever herbs you could find or grow in the yard. When it was baked in a cast-iron Dutch oven, the whole cabin would fill with the kind of scent that stopped everyone in their tracks. This meal showed up on tables for Sunday dinner or after a good hunting day. It reminded folks of home, even if that home was just four walls and a dirt floor. The meat might have been tough, the bread might have been stale, but put them together with sage and heat, and they made magic. No one complained. not when it filled your belly and made the cold nights feel shorter.
Number 25, crackling bread. Before cornbread became a sweetened side dish at brunch restaurants, it was built around cracklings, the crunchy pieces of rendered pork skin left after hog killing day. The oldest community cookbooks called for a full handful stirred straight into the cornmeal batter. When the bread came out of the oven, every bite cracked with salt and smoke and fat. No sugar, no wheat flour, just cornmeal, cracklings, buttermilk, and a hot oven. A woman in rural Georgia could feed 6 people on one pan of it using ingredients she already had. Most cornbread in grocery stores today is closer to yellow cake than anything those old cookbooks described. The cracklings and the patience it took to render them are what the frozen aisle decided nobody needed anymore. Not one of these dishes started with a trip to the store. They started with what was already there: a sack of cornmeal, a jar of syrup, whatever the garden gave up before the frost. The women who cooked them measured with their hands and tasted from memory. Soak some lima beans tonight, fry a sardine patty in the morning, and split a biscuit under it. See what comes back to you. Drop the dish your family made best in the comments. Tell what Big Mama called it and where she learned it. Some of these recipes still live in somebody's kitchen.